Long before history learned to speak in dates and dynasties, before cities rose and fell with names we still remember, there was a deeper memory written into the dust of the earth itself. A memory of fire falling from the sky, a memory of light that arrived without thunder, of wind that burned without rain, of days when the horizon itself ignited and the world seemed to come apart. What if the oldest stories humanity ever told were not myths at all? What if they were warnings? Even now, as satellites map the surface of every continent and telescopes scan the edge of the observable universe, the deepest fears of our species still orbit above us, not as superstition, not as legend, but as cycles, patterns, returns, the kind of returns that do not ask for belief, only timing. And what if, thousands of years ago, a forgotten civilization learned to read that timing in the sky with terrifying clarity? Across the deserts of southern Iraq, the wind still moves the same way it did 5,000 years ago. It drifts across buried riverbeds and crumbled walls, over plains once bright with cities that called themselves the center of the world. Beneath those sands lie libraries older than any empire, rooms sealed before Rome was imagined and before Athens learned to dream. Inside them, pressed into clay by hands long turned to dust, are messages that were never meant for their own age. They were meant for ours. The first people to write did not write poems. They did not write philosophy. They wrote observations, measurements, tables of movement, cycles counted in years too long for one lifetime to complete. They tracked stars that crossed paths, lights that scattered smaller lights, and seasons when the sky itself became dangerous. And they wrote as though the reader already understood what was at stake. We call them the Sumerians. History calls them the beginning of civilization, but their own records tell a quieter and far more unsettling story. They did not see themselves as pioneers. They saw themselves as survivors, heirs to a knowledge inherited from a time before kings, before cities, before the waters rose and the sky burned. In their tablets, the heavens were not a place of romance or distant wonder. The heavens were a mechanism, a moving structure governed by return and collision. Certain stars were not merely stars. They were messengers, harbingers, signs that the great cycles were turning once again. And when those signs appeared, even the gods were said to tremble. Modern science tells us that Earth moves through rivers of cosmic debris left behind by ancient comets that shattered long before humanity ever learned to shape stone. Most of the time, those rivers glitter harmlessly as meteor showers. But sometimes the flow thickens. Sometimes the stones grow large enough to survive their fall. When that happens, forests flatten, cities vanish, climates collapse, and history resets. The terrifying possibility is not that these events happen, it is that they happen in patterns. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the same story repeats with uncanny precision. Fire from the sky, darkness that lasts for seasons, winds that flatten cities without storms, floods that follow burning air, and a handful of survivors who carry the memory forward as myth so it will never be forgotten, or perhaps so it will never be ignored. What if the Sumerians did not invent these stories? What if they inherited them? What if their gods were not symbols of nature, but encoded descriptions of cosmic forces their ancestors had already faced? What if their temples were not built for worship, but for watching? And what if their most sacred calculations were not prayers, but predictions? Tonight, we follow that possibility beyond legend and into the mathematics hidden inside ancient clay. We follow it through lost libraries, shattered skies, and the slow ticking of celestial clocks that do not care about human empires. Because if the ancients were right, then the greatest threat to our civilization is not buried in our past. It is scheduled, and the count may already be close to complete. The count always begins quietly. Long before catastrophe announces itself with fire and thunder, it first appears as a discrepancy, a number that does not fit, a star that should not be there. a pattern that refuses to resolve. For the Sumerians, that quiet beginning was the sky itself. Night after night, generation after generation, they watched the same heavens with an intensity no other ancient culture ever sustained. And what they believed they saw there shaped everything that followed. Their world rose between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in a land where water brought both life and annihilation. Cities like Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur emerged from mud and reed, brilliant against the flat horizon. To modern eyes, these appear as the first true urban centers in human history. But to the people who built them, they were not beginnings. They were restorations, rebuilt sanctuaries placed deliberately atop older ruins whose names even they could no longer remember. The earliest Sumerian kings did not claim to invent civilization. Their inscriptions speak of receiving it, of inheriting laws, measurements, and divine ordinances that had existed before their own line of rulers began. Even their word for kingship carried the implication of something returned to earth, not created upon it. They ruled, but they ruled under a sky that had ruled first. Above their cities rose ziggurats, immense stepped towers of brick and bitumen. Officially, these were temples to the gods, but the deeper truth is etched into their angles and alignments. Each platform pointed not just toward the cardinal directions, but toward precise rising and setting points of specific stars. The architecture was calibrated to the sky with a precision that still unsettles modern surveyors. The higher one climbed, the narrower the world became, until at the summit only the horizon and the heavens remained. From those heights, the priests observed a sky alive with movement. They watched Venus drift backward against the stars. They marked the slow procession of Saturn. They tracked the cycles of eclipses, not with superstition, but with numbers inscribed into clay. More unsettling still were the entries that did not repeat smoothly, lights that appeared suddenly, trails that cut across constellations, seasons when falling stars were so numerous the sky seemed to unravel. In later cultures, such sights would become omens of fortune or romance. In Sumer, they were treated like incoming weather. Their tablets speak of danger seasons, periods when the heavens themselves became unstable. During those windows, watchmen were stationed at city walls before dawn. Observations were recorded hourly. Rulers postponed campaigns. Farmers delayed travel, and the populace waited. The question that modern scholars still struggle to answer is why. Why did the world's first civilization invest such extraordinary energy into astronomical tracking? Why did they record not only regular planetary cycles, but rare and chaotic events that occurred generations apart? Agriculture alone does not demand that level of skyward vigilance. Religion alone does not explain the mathematical rigor. Something else was operating beneath the surface of their faith. In the Sumerian worldview, the gods were not distant creators who lived beyond comprehension. They were forces that crossed, visitors who descended, fought, withdrew, and returned. Enlil ruled the air. Nergal ruled fire and destruction. Inanna governed both beauty and war, her movements linked to the restless arc of Venus itself. Even their myths of creation begin not with peace, but with violence in the heavens. A colossal body shattered, the sky fractured, the debris formed the band of stars through which wandering lights now travel. To modern readers, these are poetic images. To the Sumerian priests, they were diagrams hidden inside story. Every myth doubled as memory. Every ritual doubled as rehearsal. Every festival doubled as a checkpoint in a calendar far older than their own city walls. Their gods did not symbolize moral lessons. They embodied cycles of atmospheric shock, falling fire, crushing wind, and the long aftermath of darkness that followed. And yet something even older whispered through the margins of their texts. references to a time before the cities, before the kings, when knowledge itself descended after the waters receded. 7 sages emerged from the sea, 7 bearers of lost wisdom, 7 keepers of account that stretched backward into a world no tablet could fully describe. The Sumerians did not claim to be the first watchers of the sky. They claimed to be the latest. What they inherited was not merely myth. It was an archive of observation whose earliest chapters had been written on materials that could not survive flood or fire: wood, skin, fiber, knowledge that would have vanished entirely if not transferred into clay by those who arrived afterward. The tablets we possess are not origins. They are backups, and backups only exist when there is something worth saving. Deep within the ruins of ancient Nippur, archaeologists once uncovered a chamber that had been deliberately sealed behind brick and bitumen. Inside were thousands of tablets, arranged not as offerings, but as records sorted by subject. Some held grain accounts, others listed temple inventories, but a vast number contained nothing but sky, observations, corrections, predictions, window after window of potential danger marked with numerical seals. It was not a temple library, it was a data vault, and that vault was designed to serve a future civilization that had not yet been born. We read these tablets today as fragments of curiosity, as relics of a clever ancient people learning to understand the universe. But the language they used suggests something far heavier than curiosity. They were not learning what the sky was. They believed they already knew. They were learning when it would come back. And in their quiet, methodical way, they were trying to make sure the next witnesses would not be caught unprepared. They rebuilt their world in a land that should never have been safe. To the north lay mountain ranges that trapped storms and funneled floods into the plains without warning. To the south, stretched marshes where rivers dissolved into reed-choked labyrinths and vanished into the sea. The soil itself was a memory of catastrophe, layered with silt from floods that had drowned earlier worlds. Each season, the land reminded its inhabitants that stability was an illusion, balanced on moving water and trembling earth. Yet it was here, in the most fragile landscape imaginable, that the Sumerians raised the first stone skeleton of civilization. Fields of barley rippled beside canals cut with geometric precision. Brick walls traced the outlines of streets planned before the first homes were built. Markets rose beside temples, and temples rose beside observatories disguised as shrines. Everything was calculated, everything was measured. Even the gods were arranged into hierarchies that mirrored forces greater than kings. From the ground, the ziggurat appeared as a mountain sculpted by human hands. From the summit, it vanished into the geometry of the horizon. Priests climbed its stairways before dawn, carrying tablets and measuring cords, their eyes fixed on a narrow band of sky where danger was known to rise. The people below did not see fear in this routine. They saw order. They saw continuity. The watchers were doing what watchers had always done. Children learned their first numbers not to count sheep, but to track the moon. Apprentices memorized star names before river names. The calendar was not divided by seasons of planting alone, but by windows of risk. The most sacred dates were not celebrations of abundance, but thresholds when the sky demanded attention. Civilization here did not grow upward toward conquest. It grew outward toward prediction. At night, the cities pulsed with lamplight reflected in water. Canals cut clean lines through darkness, mirroring the bands of stars above. The heavens and the earth became reflections of one another. Every movement in the sky had a corresponding movement on the ground. When Venus slipped backward in its strange loop against the stars, priests revised their tables. When the moon darkened without warning, messengers ran through streets with updates carved into fresh clay. Even their writing carried the weight of urgency. The wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform were not slow calligraphy. They were compressed data. Each impression captured sound, number, and layered meaning at once. Their scripts were built for efficiency, not beauty. They were created for recording patterns fast enough that nothing important would be lost. What unsettles modern scholars most is not that the Sumerians observed the sky, it is how they observed it. Their earliest astronomical texts appear already refined. There is no experimental childhood in their science, no rough sketches, no erratic guesses. The tables arrive fully structured, as if copied from a system already perfected elsewhere. They tracked synodic cycles of planets with uncanny accuracy. They predicted eclipses centuries before similar methods emerged in later empires. They calculated time in base 60, a numerical language still embedded in the hours and angles we use today. Civilizations normally learn by stumbling. Sumer did not stumble. Their origin stories quietly acknowledge this contradiction. They speak of a time when humanity lived in ignorance, when people wandered without law or measure. Then, suddenly, the sages arrived. 7 beings who rose from the waters after a catastrophe that had erased the old world. They brought writing, mathematics, city planning, medicine, irrigation, and the sacred counts of the sky. The Sumerians did not describe these gifts as inventions. They described them as restorations. In the centuries that followed, the cities expanded, yet their attention never drifted from the horizon. As dynasties rose and fell, the priesthood outlasted them. Kings boasted of conquest, but always in language subordinate to the gods of the sky. Even emperors were servants to the calendar of return. War itself was postponed if the heavens signaled instability. No campaign marched beneath a sky marked for danger. The people understood that survival had rules older than politics. Outside the city walls, beyond the fields and canals, the desert preserved older scars. Heat-scorched layers of earth hinted at fires not born of drought. Glassy fragments fused into sand told of temperatures that no ordinary flame could reach. Long before these would be studied with microscopes and isotopes, the Sumerians had already folded them into memory. They called such layers the footprints of divine anger. Modern science calls them impact proxies. The difference is language, not substance. At certain sites near ancient Eridu and Lagash, archaeologists would later uncover buried settlement layers that ended abruptly in ash and heat. Homes frozen in mid-occupation. Tools dropped where hands had fled or failed. Above those layers rested a long silence in the stratigraphy, centuries where no rebuilding occurred. And then, suddenly, construction resumed with architecture more advanced than what had been lost, as if the people who returned already knew what had gone wrong. Every city was built with remembrance embedded into its foundations. Over time, the Sumerian sky watch expanded into a distributed network. Ur tracked one set of stars. Nippur tracked another. Eridu monitored the horizon near the sea. Their data converged through messengers, clay couriers carrying nightly records across hundreds of miles. The sky was too vast for any single city to watch alone. So they turned their civilization into a sensor array, and through all of it, the stories continued to grow. The Epic of Gilgamesh does not merely speak of mortality. It speaks of a king who seeks the survivor of a world-ending flood to learn how to outrun death itself. The tale of Inanna descending to the underworld mirrors the disappearance of a bright planet into the glare of the sun, only to rise again transformed. Even the monstrous Tiamat, the primordial dragon of chaos, is split apart into ordered fragments that form the band of stars wound around the sky. The myths are not fantasies, they are encrypted diagrams. Yet the most disturbing feature of Sumerian culture was not their reverence for the sky, it was their familiarity with catastrophe. They wrote of annihilation not with terror, but with expectation. Their language assumes recurrence. Destruction is not an ending, it is a phase, a turning of the count. One more return in a pattern older than any city. This worldview shaped how they lived, it shaped how they ruled, it shaped how they died. Tomb inscriptions speak less of glory and more of continuity. The individual mattered only insofar as the chain of watchers remained unbroken. The duty of each generation was simple and unbearable at once. Watch, record, pass it forward, because somewhere in the future, the sky would once again grow unfamiliar. The Sumerians believed that when the signs returned, when the stars of crossing reappeared in their appointed paths, civilization itself would face a test no walls could resist. Not a war of armies, a war of timing, a confrontation with a force that does not negotiate and does not remember mercy. And so, beneath the noise of markets and rituals and kings, an older rhythm continued to count in silence. It counted through dynasties, it counted through floods, it counted through the forgetting of languages and the collapse of empires. All while the watchers recalibrated their sights, generation after generation, waiting for the moment when the sky would once again behave the way the ancestors had promised it would. That moment, they believed, would announce itself not with a scream, but with a light that should not be there. The light that should not be there was never described as sudden. It was described as wrong, too bright for its position, too early in its rising, too swift in its passage across familiar stars. The Sumerian tablets speak of these appearances with a calm that is far more unsettling than panic. They do not cry danger. They mark it, a symbol pressed beside a date, a warning seal impressed next to a sequence of numbers, a quiet acknowledgement that the pattern had begun to deviate. Modern historians once assumed these symbols referred to political unrest or failed harvests, but the deeper translation revealed something far colder. These were not records of human instability. They were records of celestial instability. The sky itself had entered a state the Sumerians classified as unpredictable, and unpredictability, in their worldview, was the most dangerous condition of all. In the earliest omen tablets, the signs are subtle: a wandering star crossing the path of the moon, a reddish glow lingering at the horizon beyond its expected season, a scattering of smaller lights that should have been solitary. Each observation was treated as a fragment of a larger equation whose full solution lay beyond a single lifespan. The priests understood that they were only caretakers of a calculation that had begun long before their births and would continue long after their bones had turned to dust. As their records accumulated, a contradiction emerged. The heavens were supposed to move with divine order. The gods themselves embodied cycles. Enlil's wind came and went with the seasons. Nergal's fire followed known thresholds. Inanna's radiance traced a predictable, haunting loop across the sky. And yet, layered over those orderly movements were disturbances that refused to fit the divine script. These disturbances arrived in clusters. Years when the night blazed with falling fire. Years when the air itself seemed to shimmer with unseen violence. Years when crops failed not for lack of rain, but for lack of sunlight. When the dawn rose dim and red behind a veil of dust that no storm had brought. The priests began to notice that these years were not isolated. They were separated by long intervals, but they echoed one another with precise similarity. It was at this point that Sumerian astronomy shifted from observation to apprehension. Their oldest predictive models focused on planets and eclipses. These cycles could be mapped with elegance, but the disturbances arrived without obedience to planetary rhythm. They obeyed something slower, something more massive, something that moved through the solar system not as a wandering god, but as a fragmented survivor of an ancient cosmic disaster. The tablets referred to it only as the crossing, not a single object, but a path, a sweeping motion through the heavens where stars did not merely appear but scattered, where light arrived as if flung across the night, where return was not measured in years but in ages. This was the region of the sky the watchers feared most. The Sumerians called it Nibiru, not a planet, not a god, a crossing point, a zone of danger, a celestial threshold that could be quiet for centuries and then explode into significance without warning. When Nibiru was inactive, the world could breathe. When it awakened, even the gods altered their behavior. Myths speak of divine councils during such times, of war in the heavens, of judgment descending not by choice, but by alignment. The priests treated these myths not as stories, but as memos from a forgotten catastrophe. In their administrative records, the language shifts when Nibiru is mentioned. Ordinary star names are accompanied by softened signs, but here, the stylus presses deeper. The clay bears heavier force. The writing itself grows tense. The scribes were not merely recording information, they were encoding caution. During these periods, kings delayed coronations. Armies were held within walls. Vast stores of grain were diverted into emergency vaults. Boats were pulled from rivers. Travelers were turned away from long journeys beneath open skies. The population never fully understood the reason for these interruptions. They were told only that the gods were restless, that the heavens were unsettled. But within the sealed chambers of the archives, the reason was painfully precise. The path of crossing was drifting. Over centuries, the priests observed that its apparent position among the stars changed gradually. It did not remain fixed in Taurus or Cancer, as a planet would. It slid across constellations with glacial slowness. This drift unnerved them. It meant the crossing obeyed a law greater than their existing models, a geometry tied not to Earth's calendar, but to the deeper mechanics of the solar system itself. As the path shifted, old predictions grew unreliable. Calculations inherited from the sages began to misalign. The Watchers were forced to revise, to recalibrate, to admit that even the most ancient counts could drift. This realization marked the first true anomaly in their science, the first moment when inherited certainty gave way to fearful adaptation. In one fragment recovered centuries later, a scribe writes that the count had become heavy, that the sky no longer answered cleanly, that the old markers had begun to blur. His note was not poetic. It was diagnostic, a systems engineer confronting the decay of an inherited instrument. The Sumerians had inherited a warning system built by a civilization that had lived through impact and atmospheric fire. But that system had been designed for a sky that no longer existed in quite the same way. The debris field that haunted their ancestors was evolving, fragmenting, spreading, and thin streams of that ancient destruction were now intersecting new corridors of Earth's orbit. The Watchers were no longer merely preserving knowledge, they were racing it, and behind them, slowly and silently, the deeper cycle continued to turn. As the deeper cycle continued its silent turn, the Sumerians turned increasingly to the architecture of myth to stabilize what their calculations could no longer fully contain. Their cosmology was not a comfort story. It was a structural model of a dangerous universe translated into language the human mind could carry across generations. Every god was not merely a personality, but a force. Every divine conflict mirrored an instability in the heavens. The pantheon itself became a symbolic operating system for survival. At the highest level stood Anu, not as a benevolent creator, but as the vast domain of the sky itself. He did not intervene because the sky does not intervene. It moves. Beneath him ruled Enlil, master of air, storms, and pressure. His breath was said to flatten cities and split mountains. In later eras, Enlil would be softened into a wind god. But in the oldest hymns, he is something far more violent, a carrier of invisible force that arrives faster than sound and leaves ruins where walls once stood. The priests understood the difference between rain and shockwave long before modern physics named it. Below Enlil stood Nergal, lord of heat and plague. In later traditions, he became a god of the underworld, but his earliest imagery is unmistakable. Scorched earth, blazing ground. Fields turned to ash in an instant. He ruled the kind of fire that does not creep along wood, but descends from above in a single overwhelming wave. The fire that glassifies sand. The fire that ends cities without warning. And between them moved Inanna, the radiant one, goddess of love, fertility, war, and paradox. Her symbol was Venus, the brightest wandering light in the sky. To the untrained eye, Venus is beauty. To the Sumerian priesthood, Venus was the most dangerous messenger of all. At certain positions in the sky, her brilliance aligned with the path of crossing. When that happened, the risk was said to double. The same deity who presided over attraction also governed destruction. Beauty and violence were not opposites. They were phases of the same cycle. Even Tiamat, the primordial dragon of chaos, was not a mere monster. She represented a colossal celestial body that once dominated the sky before being shattered. Her body, split apart by divine force, became the band of fragments that still encircles the heavens. The myth does not describe a metaphorical battle. It describes an orbital catastrophe, a single massive object broken into countless wandering remnants, a debris field born of ancient violence. From that debris, the danger flowed. The Sumerians did not imagine their gods fighting in some unreachable spiritual realm. They placed those battles directly above their heads. Every act of creation was also an act of destruction. Every stable age was only a pause between storms of fire. The universe was not moral, it was mechanical. The gods did not punish, they returned. What modern readers often miss is that Sumerian religion contains almost no concept of redemption. There is no promise that disasters end because humanity improves. There is only the expectation that survival depends on preparation. The gods are not pleased or angered by human behavior. They move according to cycles. The only sin is ignorance of the count. Rituals emerged as instruments of synchronization. Festivities were not acts of worship in the modern sense. They were calibration events, moments when the civic clock was reset against the sky. During certain rites, priests performed continuous observations for entire nights, marking changes in planetary brightness, angular separations, and horizon positions. The chants recited during these ceremonies encoded numerical ratios and temporal markers disguised as poetry. Even sacrifice took on a darker logic. Offerings were not paid to prevent catastrophe. They were enacted to preserve human attention. Blood commanded memory. Loss etched fear into culture. Fear kept the watchers awake. The more the priests studied Nibiru, the more the mythology hardened. The crossing was no longer just an object. It became a threshold between worlds, between order and collapse, between familiar time and catastrophic reset. Crossing the gods meant crossing extinction. When Nibiru moved, the gods moved with it. And when the gods moved, kingdoms fell whether they believed or not. In later centuries, as political power shifted north into Akkad and Babylon, much of this cosmology was inherited intact. New languages introduced new names, but the forces remained the same. Marduk replaced Enlil at the top of the hierarchy. Tiamat became the cosmic adversary once more. Yet even as the names shifted, the structure of fear remained unchanged. The sky was not a background. It was the engine. And deep within the priestly schools, students were taught not just the stories of the gods, but the behavior of the forces those gods concealed. They learned when Venus reversed her motion, when Mars burned brightest, when the moon crossed specific nodes, and most importantly, when the sky entered the seasons when the crossing could awaken again. The mythology was not designed to explain where humans came from, it was designed to explain where the danger came from, and to ensure that no matter how many civilizations rose and fell beneath the same stars, someone would always remain awake when the sky began to move in unfamiliar ways again. As the mythology hardened around the machinery of the sky, the civilization beneath it transformed with equal precision. Sumer did not grow the way later empires would, by conquest alone or by the slow accumulation of territory. It grew as a response to pressure from floods, pressure from drought, pressure from the silent awareness that the world itself operated on forces far larger than human will. Their cities were not merely places to live. They were instruments designed to endure. Power first condensed around water. Whoever controlled the canals controlled survival. Irrigation transformed unpredictable rivers into regulated lifelines, and with that control emerged the first true administrative state. Grain was measured, labor was counted. Time itself became a resource to be organized. Clay tablets multiplied not as art, but as infrastructure. Each record was a strand in a web that bound the city together against chaos. Temples rose at the heart of this system, not only as spiritual centers, but as hubs of planning and governance. The priesthood managed food distribution, construction schedules, and disaster protocols. When celestial danger seasons approached, storage quotas shifted, travel restrictions were issued, construction slowed. The economy itself bent subtly around the calendar of the sky. Long before modern nations spoke of emergency preparedness, Sumer had built it into the rhythm of daily life. Kings emerged within this framework, but they did not rule above it. The earliest kings of Sumer were not celebrated as divine conquerors. They were presented as stewards, shepherds tasked with protecting the people between the cycles of destruction. Even their authority was granted conditionally. Omens could delay coronations. A bad sign in the heavens could invalidate a royal decree. Power existed, but it existed beneath the sky. Urban innovation accelerated. Brick-making became standardized. City walls thickened. Storehouses expanded vertically, stacking survival against future scarcity. Streets were laid out with drainage in mind, allowing floodwaters to pass without erasing the core of habitation. Sumerian engineering was not aimed at comfort. It was aimed at continuity. Trade expanded along the rivers and outward across the desert. From Anatolia came metals. From the Indus Valley came timber and stone. From the Gulf came shells and bitumen. These exchanges did not simply enrich the cities. They diversified survival. When one region failed, another could compensate. The Sumerians understood interdependence as a buffer against collapse far earlier than most civilizations ever would. Yet beneath this growth, a quiet tension remained. All expansion carried risk. Larger cities meant larger populations to protect. Taller storehouses meant greater loss if the wrong kind of fire returned. Every advancement sharpened the stakes of the next encounter with the unknown. Administrative tablets from this era show a subtle but unmistakable shift in tone. Early records speak almost exclusively of agriculture and labor. Later ones begin to include notations of contingency, reserves set aside for undefined emergencies, additional rations allocated during specific celestial periods, workers reassigned to reinforcement projects without explanation. The machine of the state was learning to move in anticipation of something it could not name openly. At the same time, scribal schools multiplied. Literacy was no longer rare. It became a controlled resource cultivated deliberately. To write was not simply to communicate, it was to preserve the chain of memory. Students copied star tables repeatedly, not to understand them fully, but to ensure they remained alive. Each generation functioned as a living backup system for a data archive whose full implications they might never personally witness. The rise of Sumer was not naive, it was haunted. The cities glittered with prosperity, yet every layer of expansion rested atop a foundation built by people who expected loss. This expectation shaped everything. Monuments were built to be abandoned and rebuilt. Dynasties assumed they would end. Even the afterlife held little consolation. The underworld was bleak. Survival was meant to be sought in this world, not the next. As Sumer grew into a network of city-states, rivalry emerged. Ur battled Lagash. Nippur mediated. Alliances shifted. Wars broke out. Yet even conflict obeyed the deeper calendar. Armies rarely marched during danger seasons. The sky imposed truces no treaty could enforce. And then, subtly at first, the signs began to align again. New observations entered the tablets. Slight changes in the timing of known meteor displays. Variations in Venus's brightness at critical points in the calendar. Small discrepancies that by themselves meant nothing, but together suggested the crossing path was drifting toward a new configuration. The watchers noticed. They adjusted their tables. They recalculated their windows. And for the first time in many generations, the old inherited predictions began to generate uncertainty. The sages of the past had given them the framework, but the sky was no longer behaving exactly as before. The machine they were monitoring was changing, which meant that whatever force had once shattered the ancient world was not finished evolving. And Sumer, for all its brilliance and order, was still only a temporary structure standing beneath a sky that did not recognize permanence. The anomalies did not announce themselves with catastrophe. They arrived as whispers embedded in routine. A margin note added to a tablet. A correction pressed deeper into clay than usual. A recalculation performed twice instead of once. The watchers did not speak publicly of these changes, but inside the schools and archives, concern began to coagulate into something denser than curiosity. Excavations carried out millennia later would reveal this transition etched into the physical strata of Sumerian cities themselves. Beneath layers of prosperity, beneath temples bright with offerings and storehouses heavy with grain, archaeologists would find interruptions, narrow horizons of ash, melted debris fused into soil, thin bands of charcoal suspended between intact occupation layers like scars across time. These were not the slow burns of warfare, they were signatures of heat without siege. At sites near ancient Lagash, homes were found sealed beneath a crust of vitrified sediment. The temperatures required to create such formations exceed anything produced by normal fire. They match only one category of phenomenon: high-energy airbursts, explosions that occur above the ground, releasing immense thermal force in fractions of a second. The Sumerians had no name for such physics, but they had names for the signs. Their tablets speak of the wind that burns without storm, the cloud that brings light without rain, the stone that strikes and leaves no corpse to bury. These phrases were long dismissed as poetic exaggeration, until the earth itself revealed that the poetry had weight. In the northern reaches of the Fertile Crescent, near settlements that vanished abruptly around the end of the last ice age, researchers uncovered evidence of immense thermal shock. Abu Huraira, one of the earliest known farming communities, showed signs of instantaneous destruction. Crops were flash-charred in place. Structures were flattened and burned at temperatures so extreme that organic material was carbonized almost instantly. For centuries, no one returned to rebuild. The timing matched the Younger Dryas boundary, roughly 10,800 years before the present, the moment when Earth's climate, which had been gradually warming, suddenly plunged back into near-glacial conditions. Ice advanced, rain patterns collapsed, entire ecosystems failed, the megafauna vanished, and early human societies were erased or scattered into survival mode generations deep. The Sumerians called this era the time before the waters. Their flood myth does not describe a slow rising of rivers. It describes a sky that darkened, fire that fell, and then waters that followed as climate systems unraveled. Modern science now recognizes that large impacts can trigger exactly that sequence: atmospheric heating, shock waves, dust-driven cooling, then catastrophic flooding as ice melts and storms intensify. The myth is not inaccurate, it is simplified. This realization reshaped how modern researchers began to read Sumerian history. What once appeared as symbolic storytelling began to align with geologic timelines. Multiple layers of ash and vitrification matched periods of known climatic instability, and each of those periods had corresponding echoes in the tablets: times of darkness, of failed harvests, of kings forced into exile by hunger rather than armies. In the archives of Nippur and Sippar, certain omen tablets appear in clusters around these horizons. Their language sharpens, predictions become more specific. The future tense dominates. The scribes were not chronicling what had happened. They were attempting to anticipate what might happen again. One sequence of tablets, copied repeatedly across centuries, describes a return cycle tied not to human calendars, but to a count measured in base 60 multiplied against itself. 3,600 years. Too long for a king, too long for a dynasty, long enough only for stars. When that count approached completion, the texts warned the crossing would grow active again. The bull of heaven would blaze, the scattering would return, the sky would renew the violence of the ancient age. For the Sumerians, this was not speculation. It was engineering, a long-range alert system built to trigger when enough generations had passed that memory alone might fail. As later empires inherited Sumer's cities, they inherited its nightmares as well. Akkadian scribes copied the star tables verbatim. Babylonian priests preserved the Omen series in vast libraries. Even when political power shifted and languages changed, the sky records remained sacrosanct. Wars could burn cities, but the tablets were carried out first. Deep inside the temple of Shamash at Sippar, one such library was sealed deliberately behind brick and bitumen. Thousands of tablets locked away as if someone feared that the sky itself might someday erase them. They were not hidden from enemies. They were hidden from time. When that chamber was finally opened in the modern era, scholars were stunned not by the mythological content, but by the sheer volume of observational data. Nightly logs stretched back across centuries, revisions layered atop revisions, marginal notes debating discrepancies between predicted and observed positions. This was not superstition. It was a research institute operating across millennia, and the most unsettling detail was not what those tablets said about the past. It was how much of their attention was focused on a future they would never live to see. The future the scribes were watching for was not framed in years or reigns, but in configurations. The tablets did not ask when a king would fall. They asked when the sky would arrange itself into the same lethal geometry it once had before. Everything else in the system revolved around that single purpose. Grain tallies, labor rotations, temple inventories, all of it existed to sustain the watchers who sustained the count. Administrative tablets from Ur and Nippur record entire priestly households exempt from farming, taxation, and military conscription. Their sole duty was observation. They were issued rations not as reward, but as fuel: millet, dates, beer, oil for lamps. The city fed its sky watchers in the same way it fed its soldiers, because in the Sumerian worldview, both guarded the survival of the state. Their work was silent. No public proclamations, no mass panic, only routine. Each night, trained observers ascended the temple platforms. They recorded the rising points of stars, the drift of the moon, the wanderings of planets. Deviations were marked. Alignments were recalculated. Patterns were compared against archives older than any living memory, and from time to time, a notation appeared that did not fit the cadence of routine. A symbol used only in moments of elevated risk. A warning mark pressed deeper into the clay than surrounding characters. A glyph that translated not to fear, but to preparation. The presence of this warning symbol followed a strange rhythm. It did not appear yearly. It did not follow known planetary cycles. It emerged only when multiple celestial conditions converged. When Venus crossed certain regions of the sky at the same time, the moon passed critical nodes. When specific constellations rose at dawn during danger seasons. When the count approached its long horizon. To a modern eye, this looks like coincidence. To the Sumerians, coincidence was not a category. Everything in their cosmology operated on return. Even their gods were not eternal creators, but functionaries bound to cycles. Enlil governed the moving air. Inanna governed the shifting light. Shamash governed the burning eye that measured all time. Divinity itself was cyclical. Authority moved as the sky moved. What lay beyond the gods was not chaos, it was recurrence. This worldview shaped everything, including their understanding of disaster. Destruction was not punishment, It was not moral, it was mechanical. When the sky entered certain arrangements, the world entered certain consequences. The role of civilization was not to pray those arrangements away, it was to see them coming. This is why their temples did not face randomly toward the sun or cardinal directions. Their axes were pinned to sky markers that only mattered during narrow windows of time. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the seasonal return of the Pleiades, the red star Aldebaran burning at the bull's eye as autumn approached. These were not aesthetic alignments. They were triggers. When those stars appeared at dawn during specific months, the danger season had begun. Extra watchers were assigned. Reports were filed more frequently. The archives filled faster. The lamps burned longer through the night. And in the midst of this system, one object haunted the tablets more persistently than any other. It was never described as a god. It was never described as a planet. It was described as a crossing, Nibiru. The word appears in different contexts, written with different determinatives, sometimes as a star, sometimes as a path, sometimes as the act of intersection itself. It was not a fixed body in the heavens. It was an event in motion, a phenomenon that returned when the sky crossed itself. In later centuries, this term would be misunderstood, reimagined, turned into a wandering world or a rogue planet. But in the oldest layers of the language, Nibiru is not a thing that exists. It is a process that happens, and the process it described would not become clear until modern science finally learned how Earth truly moves through the debris of ancient cosmic ruin. But long before telescopes, long before orbital mechanics, long before astrophysics had names for these dangers, the Sumerians were already mapping the pattern and building their civilization around its return. The unsettling implication was this: they were not the first to learn it, and whatever taught them to watch the sky so precisely had already paid the price for failing to watch it soon enough. The next layer of the story does not emerge from the stones of Mesopotamia. It emerges from the deep memory of the planet itself. The memory of the planet does not speak in words. It speaks in scars. Beneath deserts, forests, and oceans lie layers of sudden heat, unnatural pressure, and chemical signatures that do not belong to Earth's internal rhythms. These layers do not mark slow ages. They mark moments, instants when the sky intervened with violence so fast that ecosystems vanished before they could react. For most of modern history, these scars were misunderstood. Volcanic eruptions, lightning storms, unknown fires. Only recently did scientists begin to recognize the fingerprint they all shared. Microscopic spheres of melted rock, flash frozen mid-air. Iridium concentrations far above terrestrial norms. Nanodiamonds forged under pressures rivaling nuclear detonations. These are not the products of weather. They are the fingerprints of impact. One of these layers sits at the boundary of the Younger Dryas, nearly 13,000 years ago. Before it, the planet was thawing from an ice age. After it, the cold returned suddenly, violently, for over 1,000 years. Entire megafaunal species vanished. Early human settlements collapsed across continents. Forests burned on scales no natural fire regime could explain. For decades, this boundary divided scientific opinion. Then the cosmic debris began to speak. The melt glass found across North America, Europe, and the Middle East points to airbursts and impacts spread across enormous regions. Not one asteroid, a swarm, a shattered body entering the atmosphere in fragments, exploding in a cascade of fire. This was not myth, it was physics. And the timing matters, because the very earliest Sumerian references to catastrophe do not begin with their own cities. They begin with a phrase that appears again and again in their oldest texts, before the waters. Not a poetic expression, a timestamp. Everything sacred to them was dated relative to that moment. Kings ruled after the waters. Temples were rebuilt after the waters. Knowledge was restored after the waters. The ancient world they inherited was not the first version of the world. It was the aftermath. This is where the line between geology and memory begins to blur. Because the timing of the Younger Dryas aligns with the sky pattern the Sumerians later encoded into their most dangerous calendars. The same constellation region, the same debris stream, the same season when the bull returns to the twilight sky trailing fire, the same crossing. What survived that ancient disaster did not survive as cities. It survived as knowledge. Small groups of humans scattered across shattered landscapes did something rare in catastrophe. They did not only rebuild shelter and food, they preserved counts. They preserved positions. They preserved awareness that the sky was not always stable. Over millennia, that awareness condensed into myth. Myth hardened into ritual. Ritual solidified into institutions. And institutions eventually became Sumer. This is why Sumer appears fully formed, not because evolution jumped, because memory carried forward. They did not invent the skywatch. They inherited it. And like all inherited warnings, its true meaning faded as generations passed without another great fire. The rituals remained, the calendars endured, the counts continued. But the original terror that forged them softened into routine until the sky moved again. In the layers dated to 4,200 years ago, another disruption appears. Dust, cooling, collapse. Entire empires withdrawn from history in less than a century. The Akkadian Empire did not fall to invaders. It fell to climate shock. And climate shock is what follows impact winters. Again, the tablets speak of the burning wind without rain, of darkness at noon, of famine that no irrigation could defeat. The silence between the worlds narrowed again. Then it widened once more. These were not isolated accidents. They were echoes of a deeper cycle that modern astronomy is only now learning to recognize. A cycle written not on stone, but on the moving geometry of Earth's orbit itself. And that geometry passes through a field of debris far older than human history. The same field the Sumerians called by many names. The same field modern science calls the Taurid complex. The sky they feared was not random. It was predictable. And when something is predictable, it can be counted. The Sumerians knew that. Which means the true question is not whether they were right to watch the sky. The question is whether anyone is still watching with the same discipline now. The discipline of watching did not belong to the stars alone. It reshaped the people who carried it. For most civilizations, power flowed from land, armies, and wealth. In Sumer, power flowed from prediction. The priest who could read the sky commanded more authority than the soldier who guarded the walls. Because walls could be rebuilt, a sky event could not be stopped. Young initiates entered scribal schools not to study poetry or philosophy, but to learn how to measure motion that no human hand could touch. They learned to divide circles into 60 parts because the heavens demanded that precision. They memorized rising points, drift rates, and return intervals long before they learned the names of kings. Their education was not preparation for governance. It was preparation for survival. The emotional cost of this calling was severe. Most humans live as though tomorrow is guaranteed. The Sky Watchers were trained to live as though it was not. Their lives unfolded beneath a permanent awareness that destruction moved silently through predictable paths. They did not fear death as a random fate. They feared it as a scheduled visitor. Some tablets preserve the voices of these watchers with haunting clarity. One text, written in a personal hand rather than official script, describes a priest who spent 37 years watching without a single dangerous return. He writes that the count stretches farther than a human life, that one generation plants warnings for another it will never meet, that sometimes the burden feels heavier than faith. Another tablet records the punishment of a priest who altered a date to postpone a danger season. The city celebrated that year. The harvest was abundant. But the next season, the fire came early. The text does not describe the destruction in detail. It only states that the watcher was executed not for error, but for hope. In Sumer, hope did not alter orbital mechanics. Accuracy was morality. Yet even within this culture of precision, something began to shift. As centuries passed without a civilization-ending return, the Great Terror softened at the edges. The rituals grew ceremonious. The danger symbols became rare. Kings began using the heavens not only for protection, but for omens supporting conquest and authority. The sky that once served as a warning system slowly transformed into a political tool. And with that shift came the most dangerous temptation any warning tradition can face: complacency. The Watchers continued their work, but the urgency faded from public memory. Temples grew taller, inscriptions grew grander. The stars became symbols of divine favor rather than mechanical threat. The old language of impact and fire was still preserved in archived texts, but fewer could read it fluently with each passing generation. This is the moment where the story bends, because whenever humans stop fearing what once almost erased them, the cycle resets its advantage. It was in this softened era that prophecy entered the texts. The earliest records were not prophecies at all. They were calculations. But as direct memory of catastrophe faded, the future tense began to take on a mystical weight. Instead of warnings based on mechanics, the predictions began to be framed as fate. What was once a forecast became a vision. This subtle transformation altered everything. Instead of saying when the sky would enter danger geometry, the tablets began to say that destruction would come when the gods willed it. Instead of teaching how to interpret crossings, the priesthood taught obedience. The numbers remained. The cycles remained. But the meaning shifted from preparation to submission. This was the fracture point, not in the sky, in interpretation. It is one of the quiet tragedies of human knowledge that warnings preserved long enough often outlive the context required to understand them. The Sumerians maintained the system, but the original trauma that forged it sank too deep into time. And then suddenly, the world began to shake again. Dust storms that lasted not days, but years. Crops that failed across entire regions. Trade routes collapsing simultaneously across thousands of miles. Entire cities abandoned in the same generation across lands that had never spoken to each other. To later historians, this would look like political collapse. To the Sky Watchers, it looked like the count approaching alignment. Once again, the planet was recording the approach of something vast through the slow language of disruption. And once again, most people were not listening, because by then, the warning system had become religion, and religion no longer required that anyone understand why the sky had once been feared, only that they continued to obey it. That fracture between calculation and belief would shape the fate of everything that followed, and it would determine whether the next crossing would be remembered as history or as myth. The fracture between calculation and belief did not erase the danger. It only obscured its shape. And as certainty dissolved into ritual, a smaller number of watchers began to move beyond the borders of the known world, driven not by faith, but by the refusal to forget what the sky once did. They left the orderly grids of irrigated fields and ziggurats behind. They traveled east into shattered mountain ranges where the land itself looked burned from ancient violence. They followed coastlines where legends spoke of seas that once boiled. They crossed deserts where fragments of glass shimmered beneath shifting dunes, mute witnesses of heat beyond any natural fire. This movement does not survive in kings' lists or palace records. It survives in scattered references to seekers, wanderers, and record-keepers who served no temple but the count itself. The texts describe them with unusual language, not as priests, not as messengers, but as those who follow the scar of the sky. In later mythology, they would become sages. In whispered traditions, they would become survivors. In lost fragments of correspondence between distant cities, they appear simply as those who remember. One such fragment, found centuries later in the ruins of Ebla, describes a traveler arriving from the east carrying charts older than the city itself. The tablet does not name him, but it records that his diagrams showed the path of the crossing star not as a story, but as a trajectory. The local scribes were instructed to copy his work into their archives for the seasons when the count grows heavy. Another text from Mari speaks of stone lands beyond the rivers where fire once fell without sound, and entire valleys were sealed beneath waves of heat. These were not mythical underworlds. They were landscapes transformed by air bursts and blast fronts so violent that the rock itself flowed. The watchers were no longer only watching forward. They were tracing backward. They were trying to find the origin of the cycle. Their journey was not driven by curiosity alone. The tablets hint at fear beneath the discipline. If the crossing was truly mechanical, if it followed a massive debris stream bound to Earth's orbit, then its source must lie somewhere beyond the visible world, somewhere beyond the stars they mapped nightly, somewhere in deeper time. The problem was scale. No human life was long enough to witness a full cycle directly. No single civilization could outlast the full return without interruption. The only way to understand it was through inheritance of data across collapses, and collapses rarely preserve institutions intact. So the Watchers sought broken libraries, shattered cities, buried ages. They searched for places where knowledge had survived disaster, not by continuity, but by accident. In Anatolia, later generations would rediscover Göbekli Tepe, a place so old it defies the timeline of agriculture. Massive stone pillars carved with animals that line up with constellations that no longer occupy that position in the sky. Even when these structures were buried deliberately, someone took great care to preserve their orientation. It was as if they were sealing an instrument rather than abandoning a ruin. Far to the east, near the Zagros Mountains, there were reports of scorched circular valleys where no volcano had ever existed. Local shepherds spoke of a sky wound that fell straight downward long before any tribe could remember. The Watchers recorded these places with care. The geometry mattered more than the myths. Everywhere they went, they found echoes. Not the same culture, not the same language, but the same fear. Fire from above, darkness that followed, winters that arrived without sky clouds, cities erased without war, fragments of knowledge that no one could fully explain any longer. The deeper they traced these scars, the more the pattern widened beyond Sumer. It pointed to something older than writing, older than kings, older than temples. It pointed to a civilization of observers that had existed before the last great reset of the world. A civilization whose names had been lost, but whose measurements survived in fragments inherited across cultures that never directly spoke to each other. And somewhere within those fragments lived the memory of the first great failure, the one that taught humanity the sky could betray them, not through malice, not through intention, but through orbit. What the Watchers were slowly realizing was this: the catastrophe that shaped Sumer's fear of the heavens had not been the first, and it would not be the last. But the further they followed the trail into the deep past, the more elusive its source became. Each layer of ruin pointed to an earlier layer beneath it. Each attempt to reconstruct the original observation only revealed an older question behind it. Who was watching before the Watchers? Who first learned to count a danger that moves in thousand-year arcs? And how many times had that lesson already been erased before Sumer ever rose from the mud? Those questions would soon lead them to a figure that appears only rarely in the texts: a keeper who did not belong to any city, a witness who did not belong to one generation, a presence that stood at the boundary between inheritance and extinction, the keeper of the long memory. The keeper of the long memory does not appear with a name carved in stone. No lineage traces back to him. No temple rises in his honor. He moves through the record like a shadow that refuses to become a statue. Yet across centuries of fragmented texts, his presence is unmistakable. He is not a god, not a king, not a priest bound to one city. He is something far rarer, a carrier of continuity in a world that resets itself through fire and dust. The earliest references describe him only through function, the one who arrives after the sky breaks, the one who carries the old counts when the cities fall quiet, the one who teaches the watchers how to begin again. In later traditions, he becomes a sage. In some regions, he becomes a survivor. In others, he becomes a figure of warning that parents invoke when storms gather beyond the horizon. The watchers who traced the scars of ancient impacts began to realize that the keeper was not a single man. He was a role, a responsibility passed from mind to mind when institutions failed and archives burned. When writing vanished and cities reverted to ash, the keeper carried the numbers inside his memory. He carried the cycles in spoken form. And when the world stabilized enough to build again, he released that memory back into clay. This explains something that long puzzled modern scholars. The oldest Sumerian astronomical texts show no experimentation, no trial and error phase, no gradual refinement. They appear already mature, already structured, already encoded with cycles that exceed the civilization's age by millennia. They were not invented in Sumer. They were restored. The keeper is the bridge that makes this restoration possible. One tablet from Sippar preserves what may be the clearest reference to him. The text does not use his name. It uses his position. The one who remembers when the waters forget. The line appears in a broken passage describing the re-establishment of the count after a great silence. The watchers are told to listen to him not because he commands authority, but because he carries time. Another fragment from Nippur describes a figure who arrives from the desert after a long darkness, bringing the measure stones and the sky tables sealed in resin. The scribe notes with puzzlement that the stars do not match the tables exactly anymore. The keeper simply replies that the sky has drifted since the last fire and that the tables must be corrected. This one sentence reshapes everything. If the sky had drifted since the last fire, then the knowledge preserved by the keeper predated Sumer by centuries, perhaps millennia. The calculations did not end with catastrophe. They were adjusted afterward. The watchers were not rebooting from zero. They were recalibrating ancient instruments onto a moving sky. This is the signature of an unbroken observational lineage across collapse. The keeper did not prevent the disaster that reshaped the world, but he prevented complete amnesia. And amnesia is the true extinction of warning. Through him, the cycle stayed alive, not as myth, as math. From him, the Sumerian system inherits its obsession with correction. Every rebuilding of a temple was not ceremonial, it was recalibration. Precession slowly shifted the stars. The keeper's count preserved their original positions. The watchers adjusted the architecture to maintain alignment with danger. This is why many Sumerian temples change orientation subtly over centuries rather than remaining fixed. They were not preserving tradition, they were tracking drift. The keeper taught them that even the heavens do not stand still, and that what moves must be followed with precision, or it will outrun memory itself. But here is the most chilling implication of all. If such a keeper existed after the last great fire, then he existed because someone had also existed before it. Someone who learned the cycle the first time. Someone who watched the sky not as a warning, but as a lesson delivered through annihilation. Someone who stood at ground zero of the first remembered crossing. The keeper did not originate the knowledge. He inherited it from a civilization that no longer exists in any traceable form. No cities, no inscriptions, no kings, only the after-images recorded in isotopes, melt glass, and flood legends across the planet. And from that lost world came the understanding that the sky was not only a source of light, it was a reservoir of returning ruin. What the keeper preserved was not prophecy, it was trauma translated into mathematics. Yet even as he carried the cycle forward, something remained beyond his reach. He could track returns. He could correct drift. He could pass on the numbers, but he could not explain why the cycle existed in the first place, the ultimate source of the debris, the origin of the crossing itself. Those answers lay buried deeper than memory. They lay in the structure of the solar system long before humans ever learned to look up. And the Watchers were about to realize that the catastrophe they feared was not born from Earth at all. It came from something older than the sun's stable order, something broken long before civilization ever learned to name itself. The next layer of the mystery no longer belonged to history. It belonged to cosmic mechanics. The cosmic mechanics the Watcher scribes had only sensed through drifting patterns did not begin with Earth. They began with a wound in the architecture of the solar system itself. Long before humans marked seasons or raised temples, before oceans settled into familiar currents, something immense was torn apart in deep space, not destroyed in a single instant, but fractured into a migrating swarm of ruin that would wander for tens of thousands of years before intersecting the fragile orbit of a living world. Modern astronomy has given this wound a technical name, the Taurid complex. But this sterile label hides the violence of its origin. At some distant moment, a massive comet or protoplanet entered the inner solar system and failed to survive the journey. Gravitational tides from Jupiter pulled it apart. Internal stresses ruptured it. Collisions within its own structure shattered it further. What remained was not a single visitor, but a river of debris stretching millions of miles through space. This river does not behave like a static asteroid belt. It moves as a coherent system. Filaments of rock, ice, and metal drift together through similar orbits. Some fragments grow sparse and harmless. Others compress into dense nodes where destruction gathers mass again. These nodes migrate slowly under the invisible hands of gravity, and from time to time, Earth passes through them. When that happens, the sky does not simply rain meteors. It unloads impactors, air bursts, shock waves, firestorms. This is the mechanism behind the ancient scars. This is the machinery beneath the Sumerian myths. The Younger Dryas disaster no longer appears as an anomaly when viewed through this lens. It becomes one passage through a dense node of the debris stream, a period when Earth's orbital path intersected a region thick with lethal fragments. Not a single strike, but a bombardment spread across years, enough to ignite forests on multiple continents, enough to shroud the atmosphere in cooling dust, enough to fracture the continuity of early civilization. The Sumerians did not know this in the language of physics, but they knew it in the language of return. They knew the danger did not come from random stars. It came from a path, a stream, a crossing corridor that Earth met on a schedule too long for any single generation to witness directly. Modern calculations confirm that this stream is not evenly distributed. Its density pulses under the influence of planetary gravity, especially Jupiter. Every few thousand years, fragments cluster into compact swarms. During these windows, the probability of devastating impacts rises by orders of magnitude. Most of the time, Earth passes through the thinner edges and sees only beauty. Meteor showers, silent streaks of light dissolving in the upper atmosphere. But when the dense nodes arrive, the sky does not glow. It strikes. The evidence is written into Earth's geological record, like a pulse monitor of catastrophe. Peaks in nanodiamonds, iridium anomalies, platinum spikes, all aligned with periods of sudden climate shock and cultural collapse. The pattern is no longer speculative. It is measurable. And when the dates of those geological spikes are compared with the long Sumerian counts preserved in the Omen tablets, the alignment becomes unsettling. 3,600 years. Again and again, this number emerges, not as a planetary orbit, not as a divine number, but as an approximation of the interval between extreme density peaks in the Taurid stream. The Sumerians were not calculating a wandering planet. They were tracking the breathing of a cosmic wound. Each inhale gathered fragments tighter together. Each exhale scattered them once more. Civilization rose and fell in the quiet between those breaths. Yet one critical problem haunted their models: visibility. The most dangerous fragments in the stream approach Earth from directions that hide them in sunlight. By the time they emerge against the sky, impact is measured in seconds, not years. Unlike solitary asteroids that can be tracked across long arcs of night, These bodies arrive like ambushes, framed in daylight and twilight. The Sumerians understood this too. Their warning tablets emphasize dawn and dusk, the moments when the sky blinds the eye, the moments when danger becomes visible too late to flee. They were not being poetic. They were describing detection limits. And in the modern world, that same vulnerability remains. Most of humanity's detection infrastructure still struggles with sunward approaches. Even with telescopes and radar, the geometry of Earth's orbit creates blind corridors exactly where torrid fragments travel. The ancients had no instruments to close that blind spot. They compensated with vigilance. We have instruments, but we have lost vigilance. This is the great irony of the cosmic wound. The Sumerians could not alter the debris stream, but they could prepare for its return. We can barely remember that it exists, and yet the same gravitational clock that governed their world is still turning. The same clustered debris is still circling the sun. The same node cycles are still compressing. The sky that once burned their ancestors still carries the same scars in motion. The only question that remains is whether the next dense crossing lies behind us or directly ahead. And for the first time in modern history, we are close enough to the answer for it to matter. The possibility that the danger still lay ahead reshaped everything the Watcher scribes believed about time. Their great counts were never meant to predict triumph. They were meant to endure long enough to survive failure. Generation after generation copied the numbers not with certainty, but with dread, because the deepest terror hidden inside their system was not whether catastrophe would return. It was whether knowledge itself would survive long enough to matter when it did. Across the final centuries of Sumer, the warnings grow heavier. The tone of the tablets subtly shifts. Earlier texts measure cycles with patient confidence. Later texts speak with urgency. Errors are feared. Deviations are recorded with trembling precision. Some records include annotations not of celestial motion, but of doubt. What if the count is wrong? What if the fathers misread the sky? What if the return does not follow the measure? This doubt marks the moment when the Watcher priest stops being an observer and becomes a guardian of fate. They knew they could not stop the sky. They could only keep memory alive long enough for someone else to act. Yet even as the institutional machine of prediction grew more refined, one truth refused to yield. The ultimate nature of what traveled within the debris stream remained unreachable. The Sumerians classified its symptoms. They mapped its seasons. They calculated its return. But they never truly understood the force that fed it. Was it the corpse of a shattered world? Was it the residue of a primordial comet? Was it a relic of something older than the solar system itself? The tablets never answer. They circle the unknown without naming it. In some texts, the danger is fire. In others, it is storm without cloud. In others, it is a breath that poisons the stars. The forms change, but the dread remains constant. This is the failed revelation at the heart of their system. They could measure the wound, but they could not explain its origin. Even the most sacred archives preserve this frustration. In the inner chambers of temple libraries, alongside the calculations and cycle tables, sit unanswered questions etched into clay. Why the sun governs the paths. Why Jupiter gathers the stones. Why the sky remembers while Earth forgets. Why the count returns perfect, but the meaning does not. Here, at the edge of their knowledge, mythology does not explain the world. It confesses ignorance. This existential fracture shaped their theology in ways no later culture fully grasped. The gods of Sumer are not triumphant creators. They are regulators, overseers, watchers bound to cycles they did not design. Even Anu, king of heaven, does not command the return of the danger. He merely reigns beneath it. Enlil does not unleash disaster. He interprets it. Enki does not stop the flood. He whispers survival instructions in its shadow. The gods themselves are subject to the count. That realization destroys the comforting hierarchy between divinity and catastrophe. It tells the watchers that even the heavens are vulnerable, and if the gods cannot halt the crossing, then no prayer truly commands the sky. This is the ancient terror beneath the rituals, not punishment, not judgment, but inevitability. The Sumerians were not appeasing wrathful gods to avoid destruction. They were preserving awareness so that survival would remain possible when destruction arrived regardless. Yet even that fragile hope fractured with time. As empires rose, the precision of the watchers was diluted by politics, pride, and fragmentation. The priesthood became intertwined with kings. The calculations became state property. Knowledge began to serve power instead of endurance. Some rulers demanded favorable omens. Some scribes softened the forecasts. Some warnings were buried because they threatened stability. And in those moments, the sky did what it has always done. It returned without permission. Records describe seasons when darkness lingered, when crops failed across regions, when cities collapsed without invasion, when people described fire in the sky that left no enemy behind. The language remains technical, but behind the diagnostics, grief bleeds through. The watchers were never meant to save civilization forever. They were meant to help it endure long enough to learn, and yet the final blow came not from the sky. It came from forgetting. When Akkadian replaced Sumerian as the dominant language, the translation preserved much of the technical meaning. But as centuries passed and new tongues overtook Akkadian, the vocabulary softened. The predictive grammar blurred into metaphor. The diagnostic terms became poetic winds and divine anger. The warnings survived, but their sharp edges dulled. When the great libraries burned, when tablets crumbled, when kingdoms fell, the count fractured, not erased, but scattered. And with that scattering came the most devastating loss of all, continuity, because the system was never designed for fragments. It only works when the chain remains unbroken across generations who trust the sky more than the throne. By the time later civilizations inherited the remnants of Mesopotamian knowledge, the machinery of prediction had become mythology. The rituals survived, the fears survived, the ceremonies survived. But the equations that once warned of actual impact, windows dissolved into symbol. The watchers were gone. The count was broken. The sky remained. This is the greatest existential blow embedded in the ancient record. Not that catastrophe occurs. That catastrophe outpaces memory. That every civilization believes it stands at the center of time, blind to the cycles that will one day test it again. It is here that the mystery sharpens into something far darker. If the Sumerians were the inheritors of an even older observational culture, as the deepest tablets imply, then the knowledge of the sky has already been lost at least once before, which means our era is not the first to relearn what the sky can do. It is simply the next. And the unanswered question they carried forward into the silence was never whether the danger would return. It was whether the next civilization would recognize the warning as warning at all, because the greatest enemy of survival is not impact, it is disbelief. And as the count approaches another convergence, humanity now stands where the watchers once stood, with the same sky, with far greater technology, and with far less memory. The danger does not announce itself in prophecy. It emerges quietly inside orbital mechanics, inside radar returns, inside probability curves that climb without fanfare. While civilization argues about meaning, the sky continues its calculation. And the ancient question returns in a new form. Not will the fire fall again, but will anyone be watching for it when it does? The question of who is watching now leads inevitably to another, far more unsettling realization. If the ancient watchers embedded their warnings inside myth, then the gods themselves may never have been what later ages believed them to be. The pantheon that appears across Sumerian tablets no longer looks like a family of supernatural rulers casting judgment from the clouds. It begins to resemble something far closer and far more troubling, a system of roles, a hierarchy of functions, a living interface between humanity and the sky. Anu, ruler of heaven, does not behave like a creator god in the modern sense. He presides over order but does not initiate catastrophe. Enlil governs the atmosphere, but he does not originate the storm that carries fire without cloud. Enki, Lord of wisdom, never prevents disaster. He only prepares survivors. Even Inanna, the great goddess of transformation, descends and rises in patterns that echo celestial cycles rather than moral dramas. The gods do not control the threat. They interpret it. They regulate humanity's response to it. They encode memory so it can pass through time disguised as ritual. When viewed through this lens, the Sumerian pantheon begins to deconstruct itself. These are not eternal beings immune to natural law. They are archetypes shaped by permanent exposure to forces they could not halt. The sky becomes the true sovereign. The gods become its translators. This reinterpretation explains something that has long puzzled scholars. Why are the earliest gods not moral judges but administrative figures? Why so many divine titles reference gates, tablets, measures, thresholds, watchers, scribes, messengers, winds, and stars rather than ethical law? Because early divinity was not built to explain good and evil. It was built to manage recurrence. The gods were not born from imagination alone. They were born from necessity. A civilization forced to live beneath repeating cosmic danger cannot afford comforting illusions. It needs continuity of awareness. It needs a cast of symbols strong enough to carry data when numbers alone cannot survive. So the pantheon becomes a memory machine. Every god preserves a domain not because the universe is divided that way, but because the human mind remembers best through narrative separation. One figure watches the sky. One governs waters. One guards the underworld where the dead from previous cycles accumulate. One whispers survival knowledge into dreams. The structure is not theological. It is mnemonic. And once that structure is in place, something unexpected happens. The gods begin to feel real. People pray not to stop disasters, but to understand them. They offer tribute not to escape cycles, but to endure them. And over time, as the technical origins of the system fade, the symbols harden into faith. The diagnostic language of impacts becomes the poetry of wrath. The geometry of prediction becomes fate. The pantheon survives, but its function is slowly inverted. What was once warning becomes worship. What was once preparation becomes submission. This is the moment when gods stop being tools of survival and become instruments of power. And power reshapes memory. Kings learn quickly that fear of the sky can be redirected into fear of thrones. If disaster is divine judgment, then obedience becomes currency. If catastrophe is punishment, then rulers can claim protection through alignment with gods. The ancient system meant to protect humanity from cyclical extinction begins quietly, to serve empire instead. The gods do not change. Their interpretation does. The consequence is catastrophic for long-term survival, because once disaster becomes moral instead of mechanical, the responsibility to watch the sky dissolves. The burden shifts from calculation to confession, from observation to sacrifice, from preparation to prayer. And prayer does not deflect orbital debris. The old watchers understood this. That is why, even in the height of their religious systems, they never abandoned the observatories hidden inside temples. That is why astronomical tablets were guarded more fiercely than dynastic records. That is why the most severe punishments were not for heresy, but for neglect of skywatch. Because to the original system, forgetting was more dangerous than disbelief. But this balance could not hold forever. As generations passed, fewer scribes understood the mathematics beneath the mythology. Fewer could decode the true meaning of the future tense buried in the omens. Fewer noticed that seasonal rituals were synchronizing people with real danger windows instead of abstract holiness. Eventually, the pantheon outlived its original purpose. The gods remained. The warning system decayed. And when the structure collapsed completely, the sky did not pause in respect. It continued its cycles without memory. What remains now is a haunting inversion of the ancient hierarchy. In the world of the Watchers, humanity served the sky by observing it. In the modern world, humanity rules the earth but ignores the sky. Satellites watch stars with machines, but almost no one believes the stars can still threaten civilization itself. The ancient gods were bound to inevitability. Modern humanity is bound to confidence, and confidence is far more fragile than fear. The old pantheon has not vanished. It has been reabsorbed, not into heavens, but into the subconscious framework of civilization. Every time we speak of fate, of apocalyptic fire, of floods sent from the sky, we echo the memory of a threat that was once measured with terrifying precision. We preserved the symbols, we discarded the equations, and as the ancient gods dissolve into archetype and story, a darker truth emerges beneath their fading forms. The sky no longer speaks through priests. It speaks through probability, and probability does not care whether anyone believes in it, because whether gods walk among humanity or vanish into myth, celestial mechanics remains untouched by faith. The pantheon has deconstructed. The sky remains. The sky remains, and with it, the machinery that no civilization has ever been able to command. Once the gods dissolve back into symbols and the temples are revealed as instruments, what stands exposed is not myth, but motion. Vast, silent, mathematical motion. The kind that continues whether or not a species is watching. This is where the language of destiny collapses and the language of orbit begins. Above Earth flows an invisible architecture of trajectories layered across time. Streams of debris pulled loose from ancient comets, fragments scattered not as chaos, but as patterned consequence. Every meteor shower celebrated as beauty is also a reminder of fracture. Every streak of light is a surviving shard from a body that once traveled whole through the dark. The ancients had no concept of gravity in the modern sense, yet they understood repetition. They understood return. They understood that some visitors do not arrive once and vanish forever. Some return on precise schedules written into the geometry of space itself. And among these returning visitors, the torrid stream stands apart. It is not a single trail. It is a vast braided river of stone and dust thousands of years old, stretching millions of miles across Earth's orbital path. Earth does not chase it. Earth intersects it, twice every year. Once in daylight when the danger hides behind the brilliance of the sun. Once at night when the sky reveals what is falling. Most years the encounter is gentle. Dust burns, pebbles vanish, fire paints the heavens harmlessly. But the stream contains more than dust. It contains hierarchy, sizes, masses, remnants of original catastrophe embedded inside newer fragmentation. And this is where the danger lives. Because unlike near-Earth asteroids that approach from unpredictable directions, torrid objects travel alongside Earth's motion. Their velocity relative to the planet is lower. Their approach angles are shallower. Their detection windows are short. They arrive not as sudden invaders from the void, but as silent passengers crossing lanes in deep space. To ancient observers, this was the most treacherous kind of threat. The sky offered no warning flares weeks in advance. The danger emerged from regions of brightness and twilight, from zones where eyes struggled to separate sunlight from flame. And so the Watchers learned to read subtle cues. The first appearance of faint fire before dawn. The moment a star moves against the calendar instead of along it. The season when light arrives too early. The season when shadows grow sharp at unnatural hours. These were not omens. They were markers. Modern orbital mechanics now confirms what they could only infer through generations of patient watching. Jupiter's immense gravity reshapes the torrid stream over time. It compresses fragments into dense knots. It releases them in long breathing cycles. Clusters form, clusters dissolve. Earth's encounters with these clusters follow wave-like patterns that stretch across centuries. During quiet centuries, the sky is mostly peaceful. During active centuries, history shakes. Dense fragments enter more frequently. Airbursts return. Atmospheric shock waves multiply. Climate disruption follows. Food systems shudder. Societies fracture. The ancients recognized this coupling long before modern physics could model it. They saw that fire in the heavens was followed by darkness on earth. They saw that the sky struck first and famine followed later. They saw that destruction did not end when impact ended. It lingered in dust and cold and failed harvests. This is why their calculations never focused solely on the object. They focused on the season, on the aftermath, on the delay between fire and hunger, on the silent interval where survivors waited to see if the world would stabilize again. Their mathematics was not designed to predict collisions. It was designed to predict survival windows, to know when to store, when to fortify, when to migrate, when not to challenge the stability of a fragile recovery. This is why their cycles stretched beyond human lifetimes. Some dangers recur every few years, others every few centuries, others only once or twice within the lifespan of entire civilizations. The most dangerous cycles are the longest ones, the ones that outlive memory, the ones that return after complacency has completely replaced caution. These are the cycles now unfolding again, not as prophecy, not as fate, but as consequence. The modern sky is more crowded than the ancient one could ever have appeared. Artificial satellites lace every orbital altitude. Telescopes scan deeper than any naked eye ever dreamed. Radar paints invisible worlds in mathematical light. And yet the geometry that mattered most to the first watchers still governs every intersection. Earth still crosses the same debris river. The densest knots still drift under Jupiter's guidance. The windows still open. The only question is whether anyone is watching with the same seriousness the ancients once did. Because the watchers did not believe the sky was hostile by nature. They believed it was indifferent. And indifference is more dangerous than malice. Malice can be negotiated. Indifference cannot. The mechanics of impact do not hate or forgive. They only repeat. Once this becomes clear, a strange inversion of time takes place. The most ancient skywatchers begin to look less like primitives gazing in fear and more like computational scientists without machines. They modeled catastrophe with memory instead of software. They used story as backup storage for equations too vast for any single archive. And they understood the most dangerous truth of all. Civilizations do not collapse only because of what strikes them. They collapse because of what they forget between strikes. The sky's machinery does not need belief. It only needs motion, and motion never stops. As modern science continues to uncover the same cycles the ancients encoded in clay, another realization quietly surfaces. The warnings were never about one final end. They were about repeating resets. And if that is true, then the question is no longer whether Earth has faced this danger before. The question becomes whether humanity can face it consciously for the first time. Because for the ancients, survival depended on memory. For us, survival may depend on recognition, and recognition begins not with belief, but with alignment. Alignment between ancient cycles and modern instruments. Alignment between what was once feared and what is now measured. And as that alignment sharpens, an uncomfortable bridge forms between deep antiquity and immediate future. The watchers of clay and starlight are beginning to meet the watchers of code and silicon. And neither one can stop what is coming. They can only see it sooner. Seeing it sooner changes everything. It transforms the sky from distant abstraction into approaching mathematics. It turns probability into tension, and it collapses the comfortable illusion that cosmic danger belongs only to the past. Once recognition begins, the present can no longer pretend to be insulated from the same forces that shaped prehistory. Modern science did not arrive at this realization through myth or intuition. It arrived through error budgets, tracking algorithms, and the slow accumulation of anomalies that refused to remain isolated. Early asteroid surveys were never built to study debris streams. They were designed to find large, solitary bodies. Yet again and again, faint objects appeared moving in synchronized swarms, following similar orbital signatures, vanishing, returning, fragmenting further. At first, they were dismissed as statistical noise. Then, as cataloging improved, the noise began to form structure. By the early 2000s, astronomers mapping near-Earth space began noticing that many small asteroids occupied the same orbital family tied to a single source. Their inclinations were nearly identical. Their eccentricities clustered too tightly to be random. Their perihelion distances aligned as if shaped by a common ancestor. That ancestor was a comet that no longer existed as a single object. What remained was a slow-motion avalanche of stone. The Taurid complex, once considered merely a meteor shower source, was gradually revealed as one of the largest coherent debris systems in Earth's orbital environment. Not a narrow trail, but a dispersed lattice extending across astronomical distances. Within that lattice, gravitational nudges continuously reorganize fragments into temporary swarms. Some swarms disperse before Earth encounters them. Others do not. The danger is not constant. It is conditional. It depends on how Jupiter sculpts each passing century. It depends on how collisions inside the stream spawn secondary cascades. It depends on how close a particular fragment wanders to Earth's gravitational reach at exactly the wrong moment. This conditional structure is precisely what ancient watching cultures had already encoded into seasonal fear. Not every year brought fire, not every century brought collapse, but the pattern never vanished. In the modern era, the danger reemerged not through global catastrophe first, but through warning shots that rattled confidence without breaking it completely. Tunguska flattened a forest. Chelyabinsk shattered glass and injured over 1,000 people. Both arrived without warning. Both originated from the same daylight blind zone the ancients feared, and both occurred during Taurid season. These were not doomsday impacts. They were rehearsals. Modern instrumentation now confirms what those early watchers could only infer. The Taurid stream contains objects in the 100 to 500 meter range. That size is not extinction level. It is civilization level. Regional devastation, atmospheric shockwaves, climate aftereffects, infrastructure collapse across thousands of square miles. The difference between a forest and a city lies only in timing. And timing is what the ancients feared most. What makes the Taurid complex uniquely dangerous is not simply its mass, but its geometry. Objects within it often approach at shallow entry angles. They skim the atmosphere and detonate as airbursts rather than forming clean craters. These explosions distribute heat, pressure, and debris over enormous lateral distances. This is the type of destruction that leaves no smoking hole in the ground. Only flattened landscapes, only melted surfaces, only silent scars mistaken for wind damage or flood. Only afterward does dust settle into the stratosphere and sunlight weaken. The ancients saw this pattern. They named the wind that needed no rain. They named the fire that left no crater. They named the darkness that arrived seasons later. Modern geophysics now uses different terminology: thermal radiation, shockwave coupling, stratospheric dust injection, abrupt climate forcing. Different words, same mechanics. As telescope sensitivity increases, the Taurid complex continues to betray its hidden architecture. Radar surveys have identified multiple kilometer-scale candidates embedded within the stream's broader dispersion. These objects are not guaranteed impactors, but their presence alone confirms that the system still contains bodies far larger than those responsible for Tunguska or Chelyabinsk. Their orbits evolve, their paths drift, their encounter probabilities wax and wane. They do not announce when probability thickens. They only obey gravity. This is where the ancient warning system diverges sharply from modern confidence. Our civilization trusts detection. It assumes that anything dangerous will be seen in time, that radar will catch it, that telescopes will tag it, that early warning will convert chaos into manageable response. But the torrid geometry undermines that assumption. Objects arriving from near-solar directions may not appear on detection grids until hours before entry. Hours, not weeks, not days. Hours. This renders evacuation fantasies meaningless. This reduces defense to consequence. This transforms planetary defense from prevention into survival architecture. The ancients understood this limitation without knowing optics or satellites. They understood that when fire appears too near the sun, there is no time for preparation, only reaction, only aftermath. This is why their system emphasized cycles over objects. It was never about stopping the sky, it was about enduring the aftermath. Understanding this reframes the mythological language entirely. The warnings were never promising salvation through intervention. They were promising survival through timing. If you know when Earth is most vulnerable, you can reduce exposure. You can concentrate resources. You can fortify cities. You can delay risk-taking. You can coordinate preservation. Their warning was not that destruction could be avoided. It was that destruction could be anticipated. Modern civilization has built extraordinary tools for prediction. We map gravity with equations. We simulate fragment evolution across millennia. We model probability clouds that no ancient math could quantify directly. Yet in one fundamental way, we remain more exposed than they were. We have no cultural infrastructure for patience, no ritualized long memory, no societal rhythm built around multi-century vigilance. Our data updates daily. Our institutions reset every election. Our attention spans collapse within years. The ancients built systems that assumed nothing important happens within a single lifetime. They assumed the real dangers unfold across dozens of generations. They trained societies to behave accordingly. We train ours to forget. And as the torrid risk window thickens slowly beneath modern skies, the mismatch between ancient caution and modern acceleration becomes increasingly stark. The ancients did not fear impact as apocalypse. They feared it as repetition, and repetition is far more difficult to emotionally prepare for than finality. Because finality can be prayed against, repetition must be endured. The sky is not building toward a single ending. It is resetting on schedules longer than any civilization prefers to acknowledge. And if the patterns the ancients tracked truly persist, then this era is not unique. It is simply aligned once again with the same invisible machinery that once reduced forgotten worlds to dust and silence. The difference now is that this time, someone may finally understand what the Watchers were trying to say. The question is not whether we can detect what approaches. The question is whether we can accept what detection implies. Because once recognition is complete, innocence becomes the one thing that cannot return. And with innocence gone, the ancient warnings stop sounding symbolic. They begin to sound logistical. Logistics transforms dread into measurement. Once the danger is framed, not as myth, but as physical process, the mystery yields to instrumentation. This is where modern science enters fully, not to debunk the ancient warnings, but to translate them into the grammar of physics, geology, and probability. What the Watchers preserved with clay, we now interrogate with detectors buried in ice, radar sweeping the sky, and equations that follow fragments through curved space. In the deep layers of Earth's archives, the story becomes physical. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica read like silent diaries of catastrophe. Layer by layer, year by year, they preserve the fallout of ancient skies. Sulfates mark volcanic winters. Isotopic shifts record abrupt temperature plunges. And scattered among them lie strangers that do not belong to Earth at all. Microscopic spherules of molten metal, iridium peaks that trace an extraterrestrial origin, nanodiamonds forged under pressures that no terrestrial fire can generate. These signatures do not drift randomly through time. They arrive in pulses. They arrive in clusters. They arrive in periods that match the very cycles the ancient tablets described as dangerous seasons. When these layers are aligned with archaeological collapse horizons, the pattern tightens further. Civilizations do not fade gently in those intervals. They fracture. Agriculture falters. Urban centers empty. Trade networks snap like brittle glass. These are not slow declines. They are disruptions that arrive too fast for political adaptation. Geophysics now models the mechanism behind these pulses with unnerving precision. Atmospheric entry at shallow angles spreads energy laterally instead of vertically. The resulting airburst couples shock waves directly into the landscape. Rather than a single crater, the destruction becomes a wide zone of flattened terrain, thermal flash ignition, and turbulent debris injection into the stratosphere. The heat arrives first. The darkness follows later. The famine completes the sequence. This is why ancient disaster narratives often describe fire before flood, and famine long after both. Modern climate modeling confirms the same delayed progression. Dust thrown into the upper atmosphere does not settle in days. It lingers for months or years, scattering sunlight, altering rainfall patterns, suppressing growing seasons. The sky can strike once. The climate responds for generations. Impact science no longer treats these events as anomalies. Statistical models now account for debris streams as an independent risk class, separate from isolated asteroids. The danger does not scale only with size. It scales with frequency, clustering, and synchronization. A handful of moderate airbursts spread across several years can destabilize regions as effectively as a single massive strike. This is the critical difference between cinematic extinction and systemic collapse. Extinction is dramatic. Systemic collapse is quiet. It looks like drought. It looks like migration. It looks like war over food. It looks like empires rotting from their margins inward. Modern astronomy reinforces the same uncomfortable rhythm. Orbital simulations run backward through deep time reveal that the Taurid complex was not always as dispersed as it is today. In the late Pleistocene, it was denser, more compact, more violent. As fragments continue to grind against one another and against planetary gravity, the stream gradually thins. The worst intervals lie in the past. But thinning is not elimination. It is decay with intermittent spikes. Even a thinning stream can still deliver outliers large enough to reshape regions. This is why modern planetary defense agencies classify Taurid objects differently from long-period comets or solitary near-Earth asteroids. Long-period objects announce themselves months or years in advance as they fall from the outer dark. Solitary asteroids are often tracked across dozens of passes. Their orbits are refined. Their risks shrink with data. Taurid fragments do not follow the same courtesy. They hide inside a known river whose water we already expect to pass. They ride glare. They arrive at low relative velocities that resist early detection. They trade long warning times for sudden appearance. From a scientific standpoint, this places humanity in a paradox. We know more about the sky than any civilization ever has, and yet our ability to intercept what matters most remains deeply constrained by geometry and timing. This is not technological failure. It is orbital reality. Even the most advanced radar cannot see through the sun. Even the most powerful telescopes cannot subtract daylight fast enough. Even the fastest political response cannot evacuate continents within hours. The ancient watchers understood these limitations intuitively. Modern physics measures them precisely. The conclusion is identical. There are windows when humanity is blind. The Taurid complex passes through those windows twice every year. Most years, nothing large arrives. Sometimes, something does. This is where skepticism itself evolves. For decades, the idea that ancient cultures tracked real cosmic danger was dismissed as pattern-seeking. Correlation without causation. Myth misread as memory. Science demanded physical proof. It now has it, not because ancient texts were magical, but because the sky itself obeys repeatable laws. The stream exists, the airbursts exist, the dust layers exist, the collapses exist, the statistical alignment exists. What once looked like speculation now appears as incomplete perception, gradually converging with observable physics. And still, science offers no moral narrative, only mechanics, only probability, only exposure. The sky does not care that humans build cities. It does not care that civilizations attach meaning to stability. It does not care that memory fails between catastrophes. It only repeats what gravity instructs. This is where the ancient watchers and modern scientists stand side by side across time, both constrained by the same fundamental truth. Observation does not grant control. Prediction does not grant prevention. Awareness does not grant immunity. It merely grants preparation, and preparation itself is a social choice, not a scientific one. Here, the discipline of astronomy hands its final responsibility to the domain of culture. Data can quantify risk. It cannot decide what humanity does with that knowledge. It cannot determine whether societies invest in long-term resilience or short-term comfort. It cannot enforce memory across centuries. The ancients solved that problem by encoding danger into myth, ritual, and architecture. We solve it with reports, agencies, and briefings that expire with each fiscal year. One system endured for millennia, the other resets with each election cycle. As modern science completes the translation of ancient fear into modern probability, a subtle inversion takes place. It is no longer the myths that require scientific validation. It is modern society that now stands accused of forgetting the most durable lesson the sky has ever taught. That time does not heal everything. It repeats what is allowed to repeat. And now, with equations describing the same cycles carved into clay so long ago, the responsibility shifts fully to the present, because knowledge without cultural memory is simply a forecast without a listener, and a forecast without a listener is not protection, it is delay. Delay is the space between knowing and acting. It is the quiet interval where civilizations decide, often without realizing it, whether they will become ancestors who warned or ruins that proved the warning true. This is the space where past and future overlap so tightly that the present becomes almost invisible. And it is here, in this narrow corridor of time, that the lost civilization hypothesis begins to surface with unsettling clarity. Across the ancient world, cultures separated by oceans and millennia preserved the same story in different languages. A time before the world broke, a sky that once behaved differently, a fire that arrived without storm, a darkness that followed without night. These stories were not carried like folklore meant to entertain. They were carried like instructions, meant to survive forgetting. The Sumerians were not alone in this inheritance. Egypt encoded the same memory into the cycle of Ra and the nightly journey through the underworld. Mesoamerican calendars preserved destruction intervals as sacred resets. Vedic texts described skies that once fell apart and reassembled. Even in the polar oral traditions of the far north, stories remain of a sky that broke and burned before the ice returned. When these narratives are mapped not as mythology, but as corrupted transmission of extreme environmental memory, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Civilizations did not emerge independently from nothing. They emerged in the wake of catastrophe. Each one carried fragments of what came before. Each one encoded survival in ways that could outlast language shifts. The lost civilization hypothesis does not require advanced machines or forgotten skyscrapers buried beneath oceans. It requires only one thing: continuity of witnesses. Groups small enough to survive when the majority perished. Groups who carried not technologies, but observations. Not engines, but memory of the sky's cycles. Not power, but timing. These survivors would not rebuild by force. They would rebuild by teaching when to be afraid and when to be patient, by transmitting calendars instead of weapons, by guarding numbers instead of territories, by choosing apprentices not for leadership, but for attention. This is what the Sumerian priesthood appears to have been, not a spiritual elite, but a memory vault. Their temples were not monuments to the gods. They were monuments to recurrence. Their rituals were not worship. They were rehearsal. Their myths were not fantasy. They were compression algorithms for disaster data, too vast to store otherwise. The gods themselves change when seen through this lens. They stop behaving like supernatural beings and begin behaving like symbolic proxies for physical forces that could not be named directly. The wind god becomes shockwave. The fire god becomes thermal pulse. The flood god becomes climate instability. The judgment god becomes delayed famine. This does not diminish the ancient worldview. It makes it terrifyingly precise. If humanity did inherit this warning tradition, then the most sobering implication is not that ancient people were wiser. It is that knowledge alone never prevents collapse. It only sharpens the edge of consequence. Every civilization that carries the warning also carries the risk of eventually ignoring it. As centuries pass without catastrophe, fear erodes. As stability persists, vigilance feels unnecessary. The rituals begin to feel symbolic. The calculations drift into abstraction. The watchers become ceremonial. The warning remains intact in form, but hollow in urgency. This is when cycles close. The Sumerians themselves appear to have lived long enough for the warning to begin fading. Their records grow increasingly administrative. Grain tallies outnumber sky omens. Trade eclipses tracking. Dynasties concern themselves more with borders than with the heavens. And then the darkness returns. The same pattern repeats through history. Rome built its power during a long, quiet sky. The Maya collapsed amid climate disruption, consistent with dust-induced drought. Medieval Europe endured sudden cooling tied to atmospheric anomalies. Each society mistook stability for permanence. This is the inheritance humanity keeps receiving and misplacing. The lost civilization hypothesis ultimately forces an uncomfortable reversal. It suggests that modern humanity is not the first advanced culture to confront planetary-scale danger. It may simply be the first to confront it with machines instead of myth. The difference is in form, not in stakes. This reframing strips away the romantic distance between ancient collapse and modern fragility. It reveals that the gap between stone tools and satellites is vast in precision, yet narrow in vulnerability. Food still fails when sunlight weakens. Infrastructure still breaks under shock waves. Political systems still fracture when pressure becomes systemic. Technology has changed the speed of consequence. It has not changed the sequence. Fire, dust, cold, hunger, migration, conflict. Reorganization. The ancient cycle endures. If lost civilizations truly handed down this pattern through encoded warning systems, then humanity today does not stand at the edge of unprecedented danger. It stands within the same repeating architecture that reshaped the world before memory was written. The question then becomes one of inheritance, not destiny. Did we inherit the warning merely as a curiosity of ancient thought? Or did we inherit it as an unfinished responsibility? Because an inheritance only matters when it is consciously accepted, and acceptance requires more than acknowledgement. It requires preparation that extends beyond quarterly reports and election cycles. It requires a civilization willing to think in centuries again. The Sumerians built their entire worldview around the assumption that survival was intergenerational. We built ours around the assumption that comfort is immediate. Both systems function perfectly until the sky decides otherwise. And as the long cycles tighten once more beneath modern stars, the last lesson of the lost civilizations begins to rise with quiet inevitability. They did not fail because they lacked knowledge. They failed because knowledge alone was not enough to outlast forgetting. And forgetting is the one disaster that no monitoring system can ever detect in advance. Forgetting is the last collapse. It begins quietly, not with fire in the sky, but with silence in the mind. It is the moment when a civilization stops imagining itself as part of a longer story and begins to believe it is the final chapter. This is the great illusion that rises whenever the sky remains calm for too long. Stability feels like permanence. Memory feels unnecessary. Preparation feels excessive. And so the warning fades not because it was disproven, but because it is no longer convenient to carry. The ancient watchers understood something modern. Humanity still struggles to accept. Survival is not an event. It is a practice. It is not achieved once and secured forever. It must be performed again and again across generations that never experienced the danger directly. This is why they did not rely on individual brilliance or heroic intervention. They relied on systems that outlived kings. They relied on rituals that outlived empires. They relied on architecture aligned to stars that would still be returning long after their names were forgotten. Their innovation was not technological, it was temporal. They learned how to build memory that could outlast comfort. Modern civilization has inverted this logic. We build speed instead of endurance. We build optimization instead of redundancy. We build accumulation instead of resilience. We value progress over preservation and assume that faster always means safer. Yet the sky does not accelerate. It only repeats. And when repetition meets acceleration, the collision is never gentle. The final truth hidden beneath the ancient warning is not about an inevitable catastrophe. It is about choice during quiet centuries. The sky does not demand that civilizations collapse. It only creates intervals where collapse becomes possible. What happens inside those intervals is shaped not by physics, but by culture. And culture is the one system the ancients invested in most deeply. They taught fear without paralysis. They taught patience without passivity. They taught vigilance without despair. The warning they left behind was not meant to terrify across time. It was meant to discipline attention, to teach future minds to look up not in worship, but in awareness, not in panic, but in calculation, not as helpless observers, but as participants in survival across eras. If modern humanity stands at the edge of a familiar cycle, then the ancient message does not ask whether the sky will strike again. It asks whether memory will arrive before impact does, whether preparation can outrun abstraction, whether responsibility can defeat distraction. The past offers no guarantee, only precedent. The future offers no prophecy, only probability. Between them stands the present, carrying both instruments and distractions in equal measure. The ancient scribes pressed their warnings into clay, knowing they would never see the result. They trusted that someone far beyond their own horizon might eventually possess both the knowledge and the power to act differently. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but consciously. That moment is not confined to any single year or decade. It unfolds wherever awareness replaces denial. It unfolds wherever resilience replaces convenience. It unfolds wherever civilization chooses to behave like a steward of time instead of a consumer of it. The sky does not announce turning points. It only obeys the geometry it was given. The real turning point has always belonged to those who live beneath it. And now, as the same stars rise over cities of glass and steel, as the same debris rivers drift unseen through modern orbit, the ancient question returns not as myth, but as mirror. Not asking whether humanity can survive what comes from above, but asking whether humanity can finally remember how survival was once practiced. Because the last lesson of the lost civilizations is not written in stone or starlight. It is written in choice. And every generation writes that final line again, whether it knows it or not.